He hasn't moved in a while. Not because he's calm, because he's just read something he can't shake. The room is cold. The kind of cold that seeps through stone walls in the 11th century. The kind no silk robe fully stops. His back is slightly curved, not from age, but from decades of leaning toward candlelight. Across his lap lies a bamboo scroll, unrolled to its full length, its edges darkened to the color of old tea from years of handling. The names written on it are in his own hand, precise, unhurried, each character inked as if it might be the last thing anyone ever reads. He traces one name with his finger, then another. Qin, Han, Sui, Tang. Empires. All of them gone. He has spent 20 years cataloging their deaths. Every betrayal, every famine, every army that crossed the wrong river at the wrong moment. And sitting here, in the year 1065, in the court of the Song dynasty, he is beginning to wonder something that he cannot say aloud. Is the Song next? And if it is, what exactly survives? That man is Sima Guang, historian, statesman, one of the most important thinkers China ever produced, and almost nobody outside of East Asia knows his name. By 1065, he had already begun the most ambitious historical project in Chinese history, the Zizhi Tongjian, the comprehensive mirror in aid of governance, a single continuous chronicle covering 1,362 years of Chinese history, from 403 BC to 959 AD. It would take him 19 years to finish. When complete, it ran to 294 volumes. He wrote it because he believed something that sounds almost radical, that rulers who don't understand how empires die are doomed to kill their own. And then he hit a number. One number. And he just sat with it. In the span of history he was documenting, China had already experienced, by his count, more than a dozen complete dynastic collapses. Not defeats, not setbacks, total collapses. Governments erased, capitals burned, ruling families executed to the last child. And yet, the language survived. The examination system survived. The philosophy survived. The idea of China survived, again and again and again, in a way that Rome never did, that Mesopotamia never did, that Egypt never did. Sima Guang knew he was sitting inside a pattern. He spent his life trying to name it. And that's just the beginning. Because the real question is, how? Here is what this video is actually about. China has suffered at least 14 major dynastic collapses. It has been conquered by nomads from the steppe, by Mongol cavalry that destroyed entire cities, by Manchu warriors who forced Han men to shave their foreheads as a sign of submission. It has endured civil wars that, in the 19th century alone, killed more people than both world wars combined. And it is still here. Every other civilization from the ancient world, the ones we call great, exists now only in museums and textbooks. China exists as a living state. That is not normal. That is, historically speaking, almost impossible. So that's what we're doing today. 20 minutes, and by the end you'll see exactly how a civilization survives things that should have finished it off for good. We'll look at how Chinese political theory was specifically designed to survive regime change. We'll follow the Mongol conquest of 1271, one of the most violent military campaigns in human history, and watch something stranger than the conquest itself, what happened after. And we'll examine the class of people who held civilization together while dynasties burned around them. By the end, you'll see a principle that goes far beyond Chinese history. The most durable thing a civilization can build is not a wall. It's a system that can survive the wall coming down. Stay with me. To understand why China's collapses are so strange, you first need to understand what made China, China. And that means going back to a concept so embedded in Chinese political thought that it shaped every dynasty from the Zhou to the present. The mandate of heaven. Tianming. The Zhou dynasty introduced this idea around 1046 BC, right after they overthrew the Shang. They had a problem. They needed to explain why overthrowing a king was legitimate, why it wasn't just violence, wasn't just conquest, wasn't just the strong taking from the weak. The answer they gave was theological, but its consequences were entirely political. Heaven, Tian, was not a personal god. It was a moral force, something closer to cosmic order. And heaven, they argued, granted rulers the right to govern, but only conditionally. If a ruler governed well, heaven's favor held. If he became corrupt, if he taxed his people into starvation, if he lost the confidence of the scholar class, if floods came and he couldn't manage them, if droughts struck and he had no grain reserves, heaven withdrew its mandate. And here is the part that changes everything. The proof that heaven had withdrawn its mandate was the rebellion itself. If you rose up and won, that was evidence heaven had chosen you. If you rose up and lost, you were just a criminal. And look, I know that sounds like a dry philosophical point. It isn't. It changes everything about how Chinese rulers thought and how they fell. This is a complete political operating system. What the mandate of heaven did, what it was designed to do, was make regime change legible, acceptable, even necessary. It did not say dynasties were eternal. It said dynasties were conditional. And in doing so, it separated two things that most civilizations fuse together, the government and the civilization. In Rome, when the Western Empire fell in 476 AD, there was no theoretical framework that said Rome the civilization can survive the fall of Rome the government. The two were identical. Rome was the emperor, the legions, the senate. When those went, Rome went. China built a different architecture. The dynasty could fall. It was supposed to fall eventually if it failed badly enough. What mattered was what came after, a new dynasty that adopted the same language, the same philosophical framework, the same administrative structures, and claimed its own mandate. Collapse in this system was not the end of China. It was the renewal of China. From ashes to insights, the Zhou didn't just overthrow the Shang. They invented the idea that overthrow could be civilized. By the time of the Han Dynasty, which unified China in 206 BC after the catastrophic collapse of the Qin, this framework was already being codified into something even more durable. A professional class of administrators trained not in loyalty to any particular ruler, but in a body of knowledge that transcended rulers entirely. Confucian philosophy. Bureaucratic examination. The idea that governance was a craft that could be learned, tested, and transferred. The Han Emperor needed administrators. He couldn't trust his generals. Generals had armies. He couldn't trust his family. Families had ambitions. So he turned to scholars. Men who had memorized the classics. Men who had passed tests. Men whose loyalty was, at least theoretically, to the system rather than to the person at the top. This is the architecture that Sima Guang was sitting inside when he unrolled that scroll in 1065. And it is the architecture that was about to face its greatest test. Because in the steppes to the north, something was moving. Something that had already destroyed the Jin dynasty, already sacked Beijing once, already killed, by some estimates, 40 million people across Central Asia. The Mongols were coming. In 1211 AD, Genghis Khan turned his armies south toward China. What followed was not a war. It was a geological event. The Jin dynasty ruled northern China, and then, in 1234, it was gone. Not weakened, gone. The campaign that ended it left entire provinces without enough people left to bury the dead. Contemporary accounts describe cities of 1 million people reduced to silence. The Mongol cavalry did not just defeat armies, they removed cities from the map. Zhongdu, modern Beijing, was burned so completely that travelers reported seeing the fat of the dead running in the streets like grease. By 1271, Kublai Khan, Genghis's grandson, declared himself Emperor of China. He named his dynasty the Yuan. And here is where the story turns into something that historians still argue about. The Mongols were the most militarily successful conquerors in human history. By 1279, the Yuan dynasty controlled more territory than any empire before or since, from Korea to Persia, from Siberia to Vietnam. They had destroyed the Abbasid Caliphate. They had sacked Baghdad, killing the caliph and ending a 500-year civilization in a single week in February 1258. They were, by any measure, the dominant culture on earth. And within 2 generations, they were speaking Chinese. Not metaphorically, not administratively. Kublai Khan built his capital at Dadu, present-day Beijing, in the style of a Chinese imperial city. He adopted the Chinese examination system. He employed Chinese scholars as advisors. He commissioned Chinese art, patronized Chinese poetry, and performed Chinese imperial rituals. The Yuan court, by the early 1300s, looked more like a Song court than a Mongol camp. This is the answer to the question that man with the scroll was asking in 1065. Remember him? Sitting in the cold, tracing the names of dead dynasties with one ink-stained finger, wondering what survives? Here is the partial answer. What survives is the gravity of Chinese civilization. It is heavy enough that conquerors fall into orbit around it rather than replacing it. But, and this is the part nobody talks about, it didn't happen automatically. It happened because of a specific institutional mechanism that was working even while the Yuan court was performing Chinese rituals. The examination system never fully stopped. The Mongols suspended the Keiju, the imperial civil service examination, for a period, but they could not govern China without Chinese administrators. The bureaucracy was too complex, the territory too vast, the administrative traditions too deeply embedded. By 1315, Kublai's successors had reinstated the examination system. They needed it more than they needed their own language. Think about what that means. The Mongols conquered China militarily in 1279. They were expelled by the Ming dynasty in 1368. That's 89 years. In those 89 years, the Mongols did not make China Mongol. China made the Mongols Chinese. And when the Ming expelled them and reclaimed the mandate, they didn't have to rebuild Chinese civilization from scratch. It had been running underneath the conquest the entire time, carried by the scholar-bureaucrat class, preserved in the examination halls, encoded in the classical texts that every administrator had memorized before he ever held an official seal. The Manchu Qing dynasty, which conquered China in 1644, followed the same pattern. The Manchu were a people of perhaps 1 million. They ruled a Han Chinese population of roughly 150 million. They imposed some cultural markers, most notoriously the Q hairstyle, the shaved forehead and long braid that Han men were forced to wear under penalty of death. Lose your hair or lose your head, the decree went. But the Qing adopted the Chinese administrative system wholesale. They learned classical Chinese. They performed the Confucian rituals. They patronized Chinese scholarship. By the 18th century, the Qianlong Emperor was writing poetry in Chinese, more than 40,000 poems, more than any poet in Chinese history, and commissioning the Siku Chuanshu, a compilation of essentially all Chinese literature ever written, 36,000 volumes. A Manchu emperor. preserving Han Chinese civilization, because that was the only way to rule China. The pattern holds. The gravity holds. But now we need to ask the harder question, the one that takes this from history into something that should make you deeply uncomfortable about the present. In 2023, the People's Republic of China celebrated the 74th anniversary of its founding. 74 years. By the scale of Chinese dynastic history, that is, and I want you to sit with this, roughly the same age as the Yuan dynasty was when it began to show terminal instability. Here's the thing. The People's Republic is running the same playbook. Different language, different technology, same pattern. Sima Guang would recognize it immediately. It is the latest entry in it. Consider the numbers. The Han dynasty lasted 426 years. The Tang lasted 289 years. The Ming lasted 276 years. The Qing lasted 268 years. The average major Chinese dynasty lasted approximately 180 years. The PRC, founded October 1, 1949, is 75 years old as of 2024. That is not a criticism. It is a measurement. And here is where the modern parallel stops being comfortable. The resilient structure that allowed China to survive 14 dynastic collapses depended on one specific feature: the separation of cultural identity from political regime. China survived because Chinese civilization was not identical to any particular government. The Han could fall, China remained. The Tang could fall, China remained. The question for the 21st century, and this applies far beyond China, is whether that separation still exists. In 2021, the Chinese government's Document 9, a directive that leaked in 2013 and was later confirmed, explicitly listed constitutional democracy, civil society, and historical nihilism as threats to be suppressed. Historical nihilism, in this context, means questioning the official narrative of Chinese Communist Party history. A government that fuses itself with the civilization, that says to question the regime is to betray the culture, has eliminated the very mechanism that allowed the civilization to survive regime change. The mandate of heaven worked because it contained an escape valve, the acknowledgement that governments fail, and that when they do, something larger than the government must be ready to continue. Rome built an empire so fused with its political identity that when the empire fractured, the civilization could not separate itself from the wreckage. By 476 AD, there was no Roman civilization independent of Roman political power, so both fell together. China built something different, something that survived 14 political deaths. The pattern that saved China for 4,000 years is the same pattern now being tested in China, in the United States, in every democracy where political identity is increasingly fused with cultural identity, where to oppose the government is to betray the nation. Learn from the past to shape the future. The civilizations that survive are the ones that can tell the difference between a government dying and a civilization dying. Right now, in 2024, that distinction is getting harder to hold on to. Everywhere. That man in the cold room, tracing the names of dead empires with one ink-stained finger. He wasn't mourning them. He was asking whether China itself, the idea, the system, the continuity, was worth more than any single dynasty that ever claimed to own it. Whether the vessel matters more than what it carries. Every civilization gets to answer that question exactly once, and most of them don't realize they're answering it until it's already too late. If what we covered here is right, if the scholar-bureaucrat class was the hidden spine of Chinese civilization across 4,000 years, then the next question writes itself. What happens when that class disappears? In 1905, the Qing dynasty abolished the imperial examination system after 1,300 years. 13 years later, the dynasty was gone. Coincidence? Or the last structural support being pulled from a collapsing building? Next, we're getting into the one period that almost broke the pattern permanently, and the reason it didn't is genuinely weird. I'll see you there.